The sun had reached its merciless peak over the Utah desert when Martha Ellridge found herself kneeling in dust that felt like powdered bone beneath her weathered hands. The wagon carrying her family, her husband Thomas, her sons-in-law Jed and Carl, her own daughters, disappeared into the shimmering heat waves that rose from the cracked earth like ghostly fingers. The sound of creaking wheels and snorting horses faded until only the desert's crushing silence remained broken, occasionally by the whisper of wind across stone and the distant cry of a circling buzzard. Martha's throat burned with thirst, her gray hair plastered to her skull with sweat that had long since stopped flowing. The blue cotton dress she wore, once her finest, now clung to her thin frame like a burial shroud. Her knees pressed against stones sharp enough to draw blood, but the physical pain seemed insignificant compared to the hollow ache in her chest. 3 months of traveling together, sharing meals and campfires, and it had come to this abandonment in a wasteland, where even the lizards sought shade. "Too slow," Thomas had said without looking at her as he climbed back onto the wagon seat. His voice carried the cold calculation she'd grown to recognize over their brief marriage. "We can't afford dead weight, Martha. Not with winter coming and supplies running short." She'd stood there in the dust, watching her own daughters avoid her eyes as their husbands gathered the reins. No protest, no tears, no final words of love or regret. Just the methodical cruelty of people who'd already made their peace with murder. Now, as Martha calculated that she had perhaps 6 hours before the desert heat finished what her family had started, movement on a nearby ridge caught her attention. A lone horseman sat silhouetted against the harsh blue sky, motionless as a statue, watching everything unfold with the patience of a judge waiting to pass sentence. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that someone might care whether she lived or died. 3 months earlier, Martha had believed she was starting over. At 60, she'd buried her first husband after a long battle with consumption, mourning not just his death, but the slow erosion of their savings to medical bills and lost wages. When Thomas Ellridge began courting her at church socials in Missouri, she'd been cautiously hopeful. He was older than her by 5 years, steady and practical with calloused hands and a direct manner that suggested reliability. The proposal came after only 2 months of courtship, accompanied by news that would change everything. Thomas's daughter and son-in-law had claimed land in Utah territory, and the family was moving west to start fresh. "Come with us, Martha," Thomas had said, holding her hands in his weathered grip. "Be part of something new." Martha had sold her small house, the only thing of value she owned, besides the mysterious inheritance from her late mother. The deed described 40 acres somewhere in Utah territory, land her grandfather had supposedly won in a poker game decades earlier and never bothered to visit. Everyone, including Martha herself, assumed it was worthless scrubland, useful perhaps for grazing a few goats, but nothing more. The journey west had started well enough. Martha contributed her life savings to the expedition, helped with cooking and mending, and tried to build relationships with her new stepdaughters. But as they traveled through Kansas and Colorado, subtle changes began to emerge in her new family's treatment of her. It started with small slights, being given smaller portions, at meals being asked to walk beside the wagon instead of riding when space was tight, being excluded from conversations about their plans once they reached Utah. Thomas, who'd been attentive during their courtship, grew distant and practical, speaking to her, mainly to assign chores or express irritation at her slower pace. The real change came after their crops failed during a brief stop in Kansas. The family had tried to earn money by planting a quick harvest, but drought and locusts destroyed their investment. Suddenly, every resource became precious, and Martha noticed how Thomas and the younger men began to calculate her worth in terms of food consumed versus work produced. "She eats like a grown man, but moves like an old woman," she'd overheard Jed telling Carl one evening as they tended the horses. "What's the point of keeping her around? She'll be dead in a few years anyway." Martha had pretended to sleep during these conversations, but their words cut deeper than any physical wound. She'd spent 40 years raising children, managing households, nursing the sick, and maintaining gardens that fed entire families. Now, because her back ached and her hands shook from arthritis, she was nothing more than dead weight. The morning they abandoned her, Thomas had claimed they were stopping to rest the horses near a dried riverbed. Martha had climbed down to stretch her legs and gather her bearings, perhaps find some shade from the brutal sun. When she turned around, they were already 50 yards away and moving at a steady pace eastward. Thomas, she'd called confused rather than alarmed. You forgot me. But Thomas didn't turn around, didn't slow the wagon, didn't acknowledge her existence. It was Jed who looked back, once his face visible beneath his hat brim, wearing an expression of grim satisfaction that made Martha's blood turn cold. They'd planned this. While she'd been contributing her savings, her labor, and her trust, they'd been calculating the exact moment when her burden would outweigh her usefulness. The realization hit her like a physical blow, dropping her to her knees in the dust as understanding crashed over her in waves. She was going to die here alone in a place so remote that her bones might never be found. Bo Langley had been tracking a missing calf when he spotted the wagon from his position on the ridge above Willow Creek. Something about the scene struck him as wrong. When the deliberate speed of the wagon's departure, the way the people aboard kept looking back toward a single figure left standing in the open desert. When that figure collapsed to her knees and remained there as the wagon disappeared, Bo understood what he was witnessing: abandonment. He'd seen it before during hard times on the frontier, but it still made his stomach clench with disgust and anger. Bo was 45 years old, weathered by 7 years of desert sun and mountain wind, with hands scarred from ranch work and eyes that had witnessed more loss than any man should bear. His brown hair had begun showing gray at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into harsh light and harder truths. Most folks in the nearby town of Cedar Ridge considered him a hermit, trading with him for beef and leather goods, but maintaining respectful distance from his grief and solitude. He'd built his small ranch in a protected valley between two mesa formations, where an underground spring provided reliable water, and the stone walls of his house could withstand the fierce winds that swept across the territory. It wasn't much: 3 rooms, a barn chicken coop, and 40 acres of grazing land. But it had been home for 15 years since he'd arrived with his young wife Sarah, full of dreams about raising cattle and children in equal measure. Those dreams had died 7 years ago during the fever outbreak that swept through Cedar Ridge, taking Sarah and their unborn child in the same terrible week. Since then, Bo had lived alone, speaking mainly to passing traders and the occasional neighbor in need of help. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, found peace in the routine of tending animals and maintaining his property. But watching this woman abandoned to die stirred something in him that he'd thought was buried with his family: a sense of responsibility to other human beings, a refusal to let cruelty go unchallenged when he had the power to intervene. He guided his horse down the rocky slope, carefully scanning the surrounding area for threats. Desert could make people desperate, and abandonment scenes sometimes turned into ambushes when hidden accomplices waited for good Samaritans to reveal themselves. But as he approached the kneeling woman, Bo saw no signs of deception, just genuine desperation, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from having one's faith in humanity completely shattered. "No, ma'am," he called out, dismounting while keeping his rifle within easy reach. "You hurt—" Martha's head lifted slowly, blue eyes focusing on him with effort. Her face was flushed red from the heat, lips cracked and bleeding. When she spoke, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Thirsty." Bo pulled his canteen from the saddle and tossed it to her, noting with approval that she caught it. Despite her condition, reflexes still sharp, coordination still intact. She unscrewed the cap and drank deeply without asking permission or offering thanks, water running down her chin and turning the dust on her cheeks to streaks of mud. "They leave you on purpose?" Bo asked, though he already knew the answer. Martha lowered the canteen and met his gaze directly. Despite her desperate situation, her eyes held dignity and intelligence rather than self-pity or panic. "What do you think?" she replied. Bo respected that response. No begging. No dramatic explanations, just acceptance of hard truth, and a question that challenged him to use his own judgment. In his experience, people who maintained their dignity under extreme duress usually deserved help more than those who collapsed into hysteria. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Can you spare the water?" Martha countered. Bo considered this carefully. His ranch was small, his resources limited by ongoing drought that had lasted 6 months. Every drop of water, every mouthful of food mattered when winter approached and supplies ran low. Taking in a stranger meant reducing his own chances of survival, especially if she proved unable to contribute meaningfully to the work that kept them both alive. But leaving her here meant watching her die slowly and painfully. And Bo had witnessed enough death to last him several lifetimes. More than that, something about Martha's direct manner and quiet strength reminded him of Sarah, not physically, but in the way she faced difficulty without surrendering her essential self. "We'll figure it out," he said, extending his calloused hand. Martha grasped it firmly and allowed him to help her stand. Her legs wobbled briefly, but she steadied herself and walked toward his horse without complaint or delay. As Bo helped her mount behind him, he caught the faint scent of lavender soap beneath the dust and sweat, evidence that she'd maintained personal standards even during the hardships of frontier travel. The ride to his ranch took 40 minutes across terrain that shifted from open desert to scrub brush to the rocky outcroppings that marked the entrance to his valley. Martha didn't speak during the journey, but Bo could feel her observing everything: the condition of his horse, the quality of his equipment, the landmarks that would help her navigate if she ever needed to find her way alone. When they crested the final rise and his property came into view below, Martha's posture straightened with what seemed like approval. The ranch was modest, but well-maintained, with clear evidence of care and planning in the placement of buildings and the condition of fencing. A small herd of cattle grazed near the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and chickens pecked in the dirt around a sturdy coop. "It's beautiful," Martha said quietly, her first words since drinking from his canteen. Bo felt an unexpected warmth at her praise. He'd worked hard to build something worthy of the dreams he'd shared with Sarah, and hearing another woman appreciate his efforts stirred emotions he'd thought were permanently buried. "Home," he said simply, guiding the horse down toward the stone house that had sheltered him through 7 years of grief and solitude. Bo's ranch sat in a valley protected from the worst desert winds, but isolated from most human contact. The main house was built from local sandstone, its thick walls providing insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. 3 rooms, kitchen, main room, and bedroom. Furnished simply but solidly, with items Bo had crafted himself or acquired through careful trading. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing smoke efficiently away from the living space. Martha's arrival disrupted routines that had remained unchanged for years. Within hours, word began spreading to Cedar Ridge that the hermit rancher had taken in a stranger. The town's primary merchant, Pete Hawkins, made the 5-mile journey to Bo's ranch within 2 days, ostensibly to negotiate for winter beef supplies, but really to satisfy his curiosity about this development. Hawkins was a thin man with pale eyes and the calculating manner of someone who'd learned to profit from other people's misfortunes. He tied his horse to the rail outside Bo's house and looked around with the appraising gaze of a tax assessor. "Good morning, Bo," he called out. "Heard you got yourself some company." Martha emerged from the chicken coop, carrying 4 brown eggs in her apron, moving slowly but steadily. She'd borrowed one of Bo's work shirts over her dress, the sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that showed both age and the strength that came from decades of physical labor. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes assessed Hawkins with the same careful attention he was giving her. "Ma'am," Hawkins said with exaggerated politeness. "Pete Hawkins. I do considerable business with Bo here." "Martha Ellridge." she replied, continuing toward the house without stopping. She'd learned to read men's expressions during 60 years of life, and this one wore judgment like a badge of authority. Well now. Hawkins continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure she heard him. I hope you're earning your keep. Bo's got barely enough water for his stock and winter's coming fast. Wouldn't want him taking charity cases when his own survival depends on keeping priorities straight. Bo appeared from the barn, carrying a leather harness that needed repair. His jaw tightened at Hawkins' words, but his voice remained level when he spoke. Pete, what brings you out here? Just checking on my most reliable beef supplier, Hawkins said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Making sure you're thinking clearly about resource management. The implication was clear. Martha represented a drain on Bo's resources that could affect his ability to provide cattle for Hawkins's trading business. It was the kind of calculated manipulation that made frontier life even more difficult than natural hardships alone. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner of beans, cornbread, and eggs Martha had gathered, she addressed the conversation she'd overheard directly. He's right, you know, she said without preamble, setting down her fork. I'm eating your food and drinking your water. What am I giving back? Bo chewed thoughtfully before responding. You gathered those eggs, fed the chickens this morning, swept the porch, and mended that tear in my work shirt. A child could do those things. But a child didn't do them. You did. And you did them well without being asked, without expecting praise. Martha studied his face, looking for signs of the polite dishonesty she'd encountered so often with her previous family. Instead, she found genuine appreciation and something else, respect for her capabilities rather than pity for her limitations. I won't be pitied, Mr. Langley, she said firmly. I've had enough of that to last whatever time I have left. Good, Bo replied. Because I don't pity you. I just figure everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth before being written off as useless. And if I can't prove it, Bo met her eyes across the small wooden table. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I don't think it will. Over the following weeks, Martha threw herself into ranch work with determination that surprised them both. Her 60-year-old body protested joints stiff with arthritis muscles, weakened by years of declining activity. But she persisted through discomfort, driven by a fierce need to demonstrate her value and independence. Bo proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to milk the 3 goats he kept for fresh dairy, tend the vegetable garden behind the house, and repair torn leather with careful stitching. When tasks proved too physically demanding, he adapted them to her capabilities rather than dismissing her efforts. When she succeeded, he acknowledged her accomplishments with quiet approval that meant more to Martha than effusive praise would have. The work was harder than anything she'd done in years, but it felt good to be useful again, to have her contributions valued rather than merely tolerated. More than that, it felt good to be treated as a full human being whose opinions mattered and whose presence was welcomed rather than endured. In the evenings, they developed a routine of sitting on the front porch, sharing coffee and conversation as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. These talks revealed their personalities and histories in careful increments, building trust through shared vulnerability. Martha learned about Bo's past in small pieces, how he'd met Sarah at a church social in Kansas, how they'd traveled west together with dreams of raising cattle and children, how those dreams had crumbled during one terrible week 7 years ago when fever swept through Cedar Ridge. She wanted children so desperately. Bo said one evening, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Talked about them constantly, names she liked, stories she'd tell them, the garden she'd plant for them to play in while she worked. What happened? Martha asked gently, sensing the depth of pain behind his careful words. Fever came through town late in the spring. Sarah caught it first, but she was 6 months along, so she fought harder than most, didn't want to give up on the baby. He paused, staring at stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Lasted 2 weeks before the fever won. Baby came too early, too weak. Neither of them made it through that final night. Martha reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort rather than romance, acknowledgement of shared loss, rather than an attempt to fill the void left by his wife's death. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I've been 7 years now," Bo continued. "Thought I was finished with grieving, finished with caring about anyone beyond myself and my animals. Then you appeared, and I remembered what it felt like to have someone to talk to, someone whose welfare mattered to me." Martha understood completely. She'd been surrounded by family during her journey west, but she'd felt more alone than ever before. Here in this quiet valley, with this quiet man, she felt more at home than she had since her first husband's death. The peaceful routine didn't last long. Martha woke one morning to the sound of steady hammering coming from the direction of the barn. Through her window, she could see Bo standing near the large double doors, holding a piece of paper and examining it with the focused attention he usually reserved for injured animals or broken equipment. She dressed quickly and went outside, noting immediately that Bo's relaxed morning demeanor had been replaced by the alert tension of a man preparing for trouble. "What is it?" she asked. Bo handed her the paper without speaking. The message was brief, written in black ink with careful letters. "Give her back or suffer. You know what she owes us." Martha's blood seemed to freeze in her veins despite the warming morning air. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, hoping she'd misunderstood their meaning. "They came back," she whispered. "Who are they?" Bo asked, though his expression suggested he'd already guessed the answer. Martha sank onto the wooden step leading to the porch, suddenly feeling every one of her 60 years pressing down on her shoulders like physical weight. "My family. The ones who left me to die. Why would they want you back if they made their choice pretty clear?" Martha pulled a folded document from the pocket of her apron, a piece of paper she'd carried for months, without giving it much thought. The deed to her mother's inheritance, 40 acres of supposedly worthless Utah Territory land that everyone had always dismissed as a cruel joke played by fate on her impoverished family. "This," she said, handing Bo the deed. "My mother left me this land when she died 5 years ago. Everyone always said it was nothing, just rocks and scrub brush, maybe good enough for a few goats." Bo unfolded the document and studied it carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the property boundaries described in faded ink. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to understanding, to something approaching anger. "Martha, this land," he began, then stopped and walked into the house. When he returned, he carried a week-old newspaper he'd acquired during his last trip to Cedar Ridge. "Look at this." The headline read, "Silver Strike Confirmed at Willow Creek Canyon." Below it, a detailed article described the discovery of significant silver deposits in an area that matched exactly with the location described in Martha's deed. "I heard rumors in town," Bo explained, "but I thought they were just the usual prospector tales. According to this article, geologists confirmed the find 2 weeks ago. Every piece of land in that area is suddenly worth thousands of dollars." The truth hit Martha like a physical blow. Her family hadn't abandoned her simply because she was old and slow. They'd planned to let her die so they could claim her inheritance without legal complications. But something had gone wrong with their plans, forcing them to return when they realized they needed her alive long enough to sign over the deed. "They left me to die," she said slowly, working through the implications. "But now they need me to live long enough to make them rich." Bo's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "How would they find this place?" "Jed's always been good at tracking. And people in Cedar Ridge would remember you bringing me here. A hermit rancher helping a strange woman wouldn't go unnoticed." Martha stood up, her own anger beginning to replace shock and fear. "They think I'm helpless, that I'll do whatever they say to avoid being abandoned again." Bo studied her face carefully. "Will you?" Martha looked at the threatening note, then at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, then at the man who'd shown her more genuine kindness in 6 weeks than her own family had managed in 3 months of shared travel. "No," she said with quiet determination. "I won't." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Bo cleaned his rifle methodically, checked his ammunition supply, and moved essential supplies into the house where they'd be protected from theft or destruction. He also retrieved an old pistol from a trunk in his bedroom, Sarah's gun, which she'd learned to use during their early years when hostile encounters with displaced tribes or desperate travelers were more common. "I want you to know how to use this," he told Martha, showing her how to load and aim the weapon. "I'm not expecting you to fight, but if something happens to me, you need to be able to protect yourself." Martha's hands shook slightly as she held the unfamiliar weight of the pistol. But she listened carefully to Bo's instructions and practiced the motions until they became automatic. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but she understood that circumstances might soon demand capabilities she'd never imagined needing. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the valley, Bo lit several lanterns around the property, not enough to waste precious oil, but sufficient to eliminate the darkest corners where attackers might conceal themselves. The preparations felt both necessary and surreal, like staging defenses for a war that might never come. "I want you to stay in the root cellar when they arrive," Bo said, as they watched the sun sink toward the western mountains. "It's underground behind the house, built into the hillside. They won't find you there, and you can get out through the back entrance if necessary." "What about you?" "I'll handle them." Martha shook her head firmly. 3 men against 1, Bo. They're not coming to negotiate. They're coming to take what they want, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process. All the more reason for you to stay hidden. And watch you die for my sake, I don't think so. They heard the horses before they saw the riders, 3 men approaching from the east at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than caution. The sound of hoofbeats on rocky ground carried clearly in the desert air, growing steadily louder as full darkness settled over the valley. Bo extinguished most of the lanterns, leaving just enough light to navigate by, and positioned himself near the front window with his rifle loaded and ready. Martha had retreated toward the back of the house, but instead of descending into the root cellar, as Bo had requested, she moved toward the area where he kept his tools and supplies. If her family wanted a confrontation, she intended to be prepared for it. She was finished being helpless, finished allowing other people to determine her fate without considering her own wishes or capabilities. The riders stopped approximately 50 yards from the house, remaining mounted and clearly visible in the moonlight that bathed the valley in silver radiance. Martha could see Thomas sitting straight in his saddle, flanked by Jed and Carl. All 3 men were armed with pistols, and their posture conveyed the aggressive confidence of people who believed they held overwhelming advantages. Bo Langley. Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "We know you're in there, and we know you have our woman." "She's not your woman," Bo replied from his position behind the window. "You left her to die in the desert." "That's family business," Jed shouted back. "None of your concern and none of your right to interfere." "I made it my concern when I found her collapsed and dying in the dirt you left her in." Carl spurred his horse several steps closer to the house. "She belongs with us, old man. Got legal obligations to fulfill, property matters to settle. She's not going anywhere," Bo stated firmly. There was a pause during which the 3 men appeared to be conferring among themselves in low voices. Then Thomas spoke again, his tone colder and more threatening than before. "You got 1 minute to send her out here, rancher, or we come in shooting. This is family business, and you've got no legal right to keep her from us." Martha crawled through the darkness toward the old well at the back of the property, not to hide as Bo had requested, but to position herself where she could observe the entire situation and potentially intervene if necessary. The well had been dry for several years, but the stone wall around it provided excellent cover and a clear view of both the house and the area where the 3 men waited on horseback. From this vantage point, She watched Bo move from window to window, trying to keep track of 3 separate threats while maintaining defensive positions. The men were beginning to spread out, using their superior numbers to divide his attention and create multiple angles of attack. Martha realized with growing dread that Bo was about to face overwhelming odds in a fight he couldn't possibly win through conventional means. The thought of losing another person she'd grown to care about filled her with a rage she hadn't experienced since her first husband's death, a pure burning fury at the unfairness of having happiness snatched away just when she'd begun to believe it was possible again. The attack began with sudden violence that shattered the desert night. Carl charged toward the front of the house on horseback, while Jed circled around to approach from the rear. Thomas remained in position, firing his pistol at the windows to keep Bo pinned down and unable to take careful aim at his moving targets. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding cliffs like thunder, punctuated by the screaming of frightened horses and the splintering of wood as bullets struck the stone house. Bo's rifle cracked in response, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his position before he rolled away to avoid return fire. Carl's horse stumbled when Bo's shot struck it in the shoulder, sending both animal and rider tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust and thrashing limbs. Carl rolled clear of his fallen mount, his left leg obviously injured, but his gun hand still functional, and continued advancing toward the house on foot. Meanwhile, Jed had dismounted and was approaching the back door with a hunting knife gleaming in his right hand and a pistol in his left. His movements were careful and deliberate, those of a man who'd hunted both animals and humans in difficult terrain. Bo appeared briefly at a side window, trying to get a clear shot at Jed, but Thomas's covering fire forced him back into concealment before he could aim properly. The rifle clicked empty, and Martha watched with growing horror as Bo fumbled for ammunition while Carl kicked open the front door. Bo grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it like a club, catching Carl across the shoulder with enough force to drive him backward through the doorway. But the effort left Bo exposed to Thomas, who had abandoned his horse and entered through a side window while Bo was distracted by Carl's assault. "Drop it, rancher," Thomas commanded, pressing his pistol against the base of Bo's skull. "You've caused us enough trouble already." At the back of the house, Jed had found the rear door unlocked and was slipping inside with predatory quiet. Martha could see his silhouette moving through the kitchen knife, ready positioning himself to attack Bo from behind, while Thomas held his attention. Martha looked around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes fell on the branding iron Bo had left beside the fire pit earlier that day. A long rod of iron with the ranch's mark on one end and a wooden handle on the other. The fire was still burning from their evening meal, keeping the metal hot enough to sear flesh on contact. At 60 years old, Martha had never deliberately hurt another human being. She'd spent her adult life nurturing children, caring for the sick, and maintaining the kind of civilized behavior that held communities together. But as she watched Jed creep toward the man who'd saved her life, something fundamental shifted inside her consciousness. She grasped at the branding iron, feeling intense heat radiating through the wooden handle, even from the cool end. Her arthritic fingers closed around it with strength. She didn't know she still possessed adrenaline, overriding the limitations that age had imposed on her body. Moving as quietly as her aching joints allowed, Martha approached the back door of the house. Inside, she could hear Thomas's voice. "Where's the old woman? We know she's here somewhere, and we're not leaving without her signature on that deed." "Go to hell," Bo replied with quiet defiance. The sound of a fist striking flesh. Bo's grunt of pain and effort. "Jed, find her," Thomas ordered. "Carl, watch the front door. Nobody gets out of this house until we have what we came for." Martha stepped into her own kitchen, just as Jed emerged from the main room, knife and pistol ready for use. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. They stared at each other across the small space, the elderly woman he'd tried to murder through abandonment, and the young man who'd returned to finish what the desert had failed to accomplish. "Well, well," Jed said with a cold smile that revealed teeth stained by tobacco. "There you are, grandmother. We've been looking all over for you." He raised the knife, Taking a confident step forward, Martha lifted the branding iron, holding it like a sword despite the trembling in her arms. Jed laughed a sound without warmth or humor. "What exactly do you think you're going to do with that? You can barely stand up straight, let alone fight a grown man." He lunged forward with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never considered that his elderly victim might possess hidden reserves of strength and determination. Martha waited until the last possible moment, drawing on instincts she'd never known she possessed, then stepped to one side and drove the red-hot iron into his thigh with every ounce of force her desperate body could generate. Jed's scream pierced the night, a sound of pure agony that seemed to freeze everyone else in their positions. The smell of burning cloth and flesh filled the kitchen, making Martha's stomach lurch, but she maintained her grip on the iron and pressed it deeper into his leg until he collapsed, writhing on the floor in shock and pain. "She's got Jed," Carl shouted from the front room. Thomas spun toward the sound of screaming, his attention divided between Bo and the unexpected development in the kitchen. That moment of distraction was exactly what Bo needed. He grabbed Thomas's gun hand, forcing it toward the ceiling, and drove his elbow into the older man's ribs with desperate strength. Carl abandoned his position at the front door and rushed toward the kitchen, but Bo was already in motion. He tackled Carl from behind, sending them both crashing into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. They fought hand-to-hand in the narrow hallway, throwing punches that echoed like gunshots in the confined space. Martha dropped the branding iron and picked up Jed's knife from where he'd fallen. The weapon felt foreign and terrible in her hands, but she gripped it firmly as she backed toward the main room where Bo and Thomas were still struggling for control of the pistol. Thomas had recovered his breath and was fighting with the desperate strength of a man who understood that failure meant losing his last chance at significant wealth. He was older than Bo, but leaner with sinew toughened by years of frontier hardship. He managed to press his pistol against Bo's chest, finger tightening on the trigger. "Should have minded your own business, rancher," Thomas panted. Martha appeared behind him like a vengeful spirit, pressing Jed's razor-sharp knife against his throat. Her hand trembled with exhaustion and reaction, but the blade was keen enough to draw a thin line of blood across his weathered skin. "Let him go, Thomas," she said with deadly quiet. Thomas froze, recognizing the voice and understanding his suddenly precarious position. "Martha, you don't want to do this, don't I? You married me for my savings, used me for labor on the trail, and then left me to die when I became inconvenient. You came back with weapons to force me to sign away my inheritance. Tell me why I shouldn't want to do this. That was just business. Nothing personal, Martha. You understand how these things work. Everything is personal when it's your life being thrown away." Martha's voice remained steady despite the chaos around them. "Drop the gun." Thomas hesitated, calculating odds and alternatives. In the kitchen, Jed moaned softly, still conscious, but unable to stand. Carl lay unconscious in the hallway, blood trickling from his nose where Bo's final punch had connected. The situation had reversed completely, and Thomas knew it. He dropped the pistol. Bo kicked the weapon away and retrieved rope from his supply shelf. Within minutes, all three attackers were securely bound and disarmed. Carl was beginning to regain consciousness, blinking in confusion at his changed circumstances. Jed sat propped against the kitchen wall, his burned legs stretched out before him, face pale with shock and continuing pain. Thomas glared at Martha with pure hatred. "You'll regret this, old woman. We're family whether you like it or not. You can't just... Family doesn't abandon each other to die in the desert." Martha interrupted her voice, carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. "Family doesn't return with guns and knives to steal what isn't theirs. You stopped being my family the moment you drove away and left me for dead." She handed Jed's knife to Bo and walked outside to sit on the porch steps. Her hands were shaking now, delayed reaction setting in as adrenaline faded and the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. She'd hurt someone, deliberately caused real physical damage to another human being, and while she didn't regret the necessity of her actions, the weight of crossing that line sat heavily on her conscience. Bo joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady either. His shirt was torn, and he was developing what would become a spectacular black eye. But he was alive and victorious. "You saved my life," he said, simply settling beside her on the wooden step. "You saved mine first," Martha replied. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the desert wind and watching stars emerge in the clear night sky. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a sound of connection across the vast loneliness of the frontier. Sheriff Hammond arrived with the sunrise, having heard the gunfire from his cabin several miles to the east. He was a practical man in his 50s, with gray hair and weathered features that spoke of decades spent maintaining law and order in a territory where such concepts were often more theoretical than real. Hammond surveyed the scene with professional thoroughness. 3 bound men, one nursing a serious burn, clear evidence of a violent struggle, and 2 people who looked like they'd survived a war, but emerged victorious. "Morning, Bo, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Martha. "Someone want to explain what happened here." Bo provided a clear chronological account of events, the abandonment, the threatening note, the armed attack on his property. Martha added details about her inheritance and her family's true motives for returning. Hammond listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or examining physical evidence. When they finished their account, he questioned each of the bound men separately. Thomas attempted to claim they'd come to rescue Martha from kidnapping, but his story fell apart under Hammond's experienced questioning. Jed, still suffering from his burn injury, admitted they'd wanted Martha to sign over her deed to the valuable land. Carl maintained sullen silence throughout his interrogation. "Here's how I see this situation," Hammond said, finally addressing everyone present. "These 3 men abandoned a family member in the desert to die, then returned with weapons to threaten and assault law-abiding citizens on their own property. That constitutes attempted murder and armed robbery under territorial law. They're my family," Martha said quietly. "Doesn't that give me some say in what happens to them?" Hammond considered this carefully. "What did you have in mind, ma'am?" Martha looked at the 3 men who'd been willing to kill her for money. Thomas met her gaze with continuing defiance, despite his defeat. Jed stared at the ground, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of his crimes. Carl seemed dazed by the rapid reversal of their fortunes. "They leave," she said with finality. "Today. They go back where they came from, and they never contact me again. If I see any of them within 100 miles of this place, I'll swear out warrants for attempted murder." "That's considerably more generous than they deserve," Hammond observed. "I'm tired of carrying hatred around," Martha replied. "But I'm not stupid enough to trust them again. Sheriff, I want you to witness something." She retrieved her deed and a pencil, then wrote carefully across the bottom margin, "I, Martha Ellridge, hereby deed this property to Bo Langley of Cedar Ridge, Utah Territory, in recognition of his kindness and protection, and in gratitude for his saving my life. Witness this day." She added the date and signed her name with a flourish before handing the document to Hammond for his signature as witness. "You're giving me your land?" Bo asked, clearly astonished by this development. "Martha, that property is worth thousands of dollars. I'm giving it to someone who'll use it wisely and honorably," Martha corrected. "Someone who saved my life and asked for nothing in return except honest work and decent companionship." Thomas exploded with rage. "You can't do that. That land belongs to the family. It's worth a fortune." "I can do whatever I choose with my own property," Martha said calmly. "And I just did exactly that." Hammond helped load the 3 men into their wagon, with Jed lying in the back, due to his injury, and Carl still nursing bruises from his fight with Bo. Thomas took the reins, his face a mask of bitter defeat and continuing hatred. "This isn't finished," he said as they prepared to leave. "Yes, it is," Hammond replied firmly. "And if I hear reports of you bothering these people again, you'll be looking at the inside of a territorial prison. Now get moving before I change my mind about being lenient." They watched the wagon disappear into the desert heat, heading east toward whatever remained of their disrupted lives. Martha felt no satisfaction in their defeat, but she experienced something more valuable, a profound sense of peace and closure. The deed to her valuable inheritance now bore Bo's name, but more importantly, it represented a choice she'd made freely, rather than having decisions imposed upon her by others. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Martha felt truly in control of her own destiny. Over the following weeks, Martha and Bo settled into routines that felt more like partnership than mere cohabitation. The silver mine on Martha's former property, now Bo's property, began producing wealth that exceeded even the newspaper's optimistic projections. But more significant than the financial windfall was the sense of purpose and mutual respect that had developed between them. They used some of the mining income to improve the ranch, adding a larger barn and expanding the house to include a proper guest room and a larger kitchen. Martha insisted on contributing her labor to these projects, despite Bo's protests that she'd already given enough. "I'm not an invalid," she told him firmly while helping to paint the new additions. "I may be 60 years old, but I can still swing a paintbrush and carry my share of any load." Bo had learned not to argue with Martha when she made such declarations. Her determination and competence had proven themselves too thoroughly for him to question her capabilities. One evening, while Martha was organizing Bo's small collection of books and papers, she discovered a wooden box tucked behind a stack of farming almanacs. It was carved from oak and polished smooth by years of handling, no larger than a cigar box, but clearly precious to its owner based on its careful placement and obvious care. Martha hesitated, understanding that some private possessions were meant to remain private. But something about the box's deliberate concealment suggested it contained items of deep emotional significance, and her curiosity finally overcame her respect for Bo's privacy. Inside, nestled in faded blue fabric, were tiny clothes. A knitted cap small enough to fit in her palm, a pair of booties that would accommodate a newborn, and a small gown made from white cotton with delicate embroidery around the collar. At the bottom of the box was a piece of paper bearing a single line written in careful script. "Bo Langley, born sleeping October 15th, 1863. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she understood what she'd found. Bo had named his stillborn son, and for 7 years he'd kept these memorial items as a private shrine to the child who'd never drawn breath. The discovery revealed depths of grief and love that Bo had never shared, even during their most intimate conversations. She closed the box carefully and returned it to its hiding place. But that evening, she found the courage to address what she'd learned. "I found something today while organizing," she said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I didn't mean to pry, but I discovered a box with baby clothes and a name written on paper." Bo tensed, visibly jaw-tightening with the effort of controlling emotions he'd kept private for years. "What did you find?" "Abel. You named him Abel." Bo was quiet for so long that Martha began to worry she'd violated something sacred by mentioning her discovery. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the evening wind. "Sarah chose that name. Said it meant breath of God, which seemed appropriate since we'd been praying so hard for a child." His hands gripped his coffee cup with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "After they both died, I needed to honor him somehow. Give him an identity even though he never had a chance to use it." Martha reached across the space between their chairs and covered his hands with hers, a gesture of comfort and understanding, rather than romantic advance. "You did honor him. Keeping those clothes, preserving his name, that was love in its purest form. Was it love or just my inability to accept what I'd lost?" Both, maybe. But that's what love often requires, holding on to what matters most, even when it causes pain. They sat in silence as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. The desert around them whispered with small sounds, night birds calling distant coyotes, singing the rustle of wind through sage and creosote bushes. Finally, Bo spoke again, his voice stronger now. "When I found you in the desert, I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do. Being neighborly, helping someone in desperate need. But having you here talking with someone again, remembering what it feels like to care about another person's well-being." He paused, searching for adequate words. "You brought something back to life in me that I'd thought was permanently dead." Martha smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the desert day. "You did the same for me, Bo. My family treated me like a burden, something to be discarded when I became inconvenient. But you see value in me, treat me like my thoughts and contributions matter. You make me feel like I still have purpose. You do have purpose, Martha, more than you know." She squeezed his hands gently. "And so do you, Bo. So do you." In the weeks that followed, their partnership deepened into something that transcended conventional categories. They weren't lovers in the physical sense. Both were too old and too scarred by loss for such complications. But they were companions, in the truest meaning of the word, two people who'd found each other across the vast loneliness of the frontier and chosen to build something meaningful together. The silver mine continued producing wealth that allowed them to expand their ranch and improve their standard of living. They added cattle to their small herd, built better facilities for their chickens and goats, and established a vegetable garden large enough to provide fresh food year-round. Martha proved to have an excellent head for business, helping Bo negotiate fair contracts with mining companies and managing the financial aspects of their growing prosperity. But more valuable than silver or cattle or improved buildings was the simple miracle of mutual respect and genuine affection. Martha had been abandoned by people who should have protected her, left to die, because others considered her worthless. Bo had lost his wife and child, then spent 7 years believing he was finished with love and connection. Together, they discovered that healing was possible at any age, that second chances could appear in the most unexpected circumstances, and that the human capacity for caring could survive even the cruelest betrayals and losses. On quiet evenings, they made plans for their shared future, modest goals that reflected their practical natures and hard-won wisdom. They would continue improving the ranch, perhaps build a small guest house for visitors who might never come. Martha wanted to plant fruit trees that would provide shade and sustenance for decades. Bo talked about breeding better cattle, developing bloodlines that could thrive in desert conditions. These weren't grand dreams of youth, but they were real and achievable, built on solid foundations of mutual support and realistic expectations. Most importantly, they were shared dreams created by two people who'd learned to value companionship over romance, partnership over passion, and loyalty over convenience. The box containing Abel's memorial clothes remained in its hiding place, but it was no longer a source of solitary grief. It had become a bridge between past sorrow and present contentment, a reminder that love persists even when its objects are lost, and that healing often comes in unexpected forms. Martha Ellridge had been left to die in the desert because her family considered her too old and burdensome to matter. In saving her, Bo Langley had discovered that she mattered more than silver, more than wealth, more than the material prosperity that drove other people to cruelty and abandonment. She mattered because she was human, because she was kind, because she'd proven that even at 60, even after being discarded and betrayed, a person could still contribute meaningfully to another's life and happiness. As autumn settled over the valley and they prepared for their first winter together, Martha and Bo found themselves planning not just for survival, but for joy. They would read books by the fireplace, share stories of their pasts, and continue building the kind of partnership that transcended age and circumstance. The desert that had nearly claimed Martha's life had instead delivered her to exactly where she needed to be: home. with someone who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. And Bo, who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his wife and child, had learned that the heart could expand to encompass new forms of affection without diminishing what had come before. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered in a world that too often measured worth by youth and productivity rather than wisdom and kindness. They had each other, they had their shared home, and they had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, sometimes against all odds, people who matter find each other just when they need it most.